Good evening, one and all. I hope you're very well. 8 o'clock here in lovely London. Hello. So no one's come up on the chat, but I can see hearts, so I know that people are here. It's Gerard here. Oh, it's a chilly night, but it's dry and crisp. And we're on Blackfriars Bridge, and we're going to have a little chat. Let me turn you around to show you what I can see. You can see the Sea Containers building with the Oxo Tower. Beautiful lights of London. One of the old power stations here, that's the old Pioneer power station. Used to be owned by the company that made Oxo cubes, so bouillon or beef extract. And they wanted to advertise their product, Oxo, and they weren't allowed to have skyline advertising. So they had 3 Art Deco windows put at the top of one of their towers, a circular window, a crossed window, and a circular window. So it's spelt Oxo. Clever people. So that's one power station. Then in the distance there, you can see the Shard. Just to the right of it, there's a dark chimney. As the chimney of the Tate Modern Art Gallery, also known as the Bankside Power Station. So we're going to talk about some myths and mysteries regarding William Shakespeare. Nobody has turned up on the chat yet, so I'm hoping that there are people on the chat. I can see the hearts. So sometimes with beams it does take a while. Ah, okay. So there are people here, and gradually they're turning up. There's St. Paul's Cathedral. Everything beautifully lit tonight. And we've got to start, really, like all good stories, or most of them, at the beginning. 1564, William Shakespeare, born in Stratford-upon-Avon. It's a town in that direction, the centre of the screen. If you went 103 miles or 166 kilometres, you would be in Stratford. You would find his home. There were no theatres where he lived. So one of the big questions, the big mysteries of his life happens, well, first of all, it happens when he was born. We seem to celebrate Shakespeare's birthday and the date of his death as the 23rd of April. But we don't know that for certain. We know the day he was christened at the Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, and we know the day he was buried there. And they weren't on the 23rd. He was buried on the 26th. They've taken 3 days off it and said that's when he must have died. And you also have when he was born. He was christened on the 25th. They've said it's the 3rd day, so they've added 2 days to the 23rd and said, well, he must have been born on the 23rd. So that's one myth straight away, straight off the bat. The next myth or mystery, really, is how a man came from a town where there were no theatres, 6 days walk, as I said, 103 miles from here. How did this guy manage to get inspired to be a writer in London? It's believed that he saw an acting company when he was about 13 in Stratford. These areas, the same as in the last 2.5 to 3 years, had lockdowns. They had circuit breakers. Whenever there was an outbreak of the plague, whenever there were more than 30 deaths in a week, they would announce the death figures on a Thursday. And if there were more than 30 deaths, they closed the theatres down. When Shakespeare was 13, in Southwark, on the other side of the river, so we've now crossed to the north side, but on the south bank, where the Globe is now, they closed 3 theatres. And the acting companies had to try and make money. So they travelled the country. They went to towns where there were no plague outbreaks, or where they didn't think there were. And they would rock up with a few curtains to signify set and scenery, some painted backdrops, a few props, swords, crowns, cups, goblets, plates, chairs, tables, clothing, and the words in their head. It was easy for them to travel, and they would do that regularly when there were plague outbreaks. And when Shakespeare was 13, that's what an acting company did. They travelled to Stratford, and we believe that he saw them in the market square. It's never been documented that he saw them, but how else would he have been inspired to be a writer unless an acting company had visited him? He didn't travel. Most people didn't travel, especially in this area. When you went to a theatre, you were normally a local person, unless you were aristocracy from abroad. And a place like the Globe Theatre held 3,000 people. Stratford-upon-Avon was a town of 1,000. So a small town, an acting company in the main market square for a week, he must have seen them. This is Blackfriars Station, the tube station. And we walked over from the other side, well, about halfway along. The train track is on the other side, the overground, and this is what they call the underground. Blackfriars is the only station in the country that is on two sides of the river. And the reason it's called Blackfriars is there was a monastery here named the Blackfriars Monastery. There was a Grey Friars, a White Friars, and a Black Friars. It was to do with the robes that they wore. They were a Catholic monastery. And in the 1530s, Henry VIII decided he wanted to get married again to Anne Boleyn. He was convinced that his wife, the Catholic Catherine of Aragon from Spain, convinced that she was incapable of giving him a son. So he broke with the Catholic Church. And then something happened called the dissolution of the monasteries. He dissolved the monasteries. He took the land away from the church, and gradually he handed bits and pieces out to aristocracy, to friends of his, people who agreed with what he was doing. This is one of the oldest pubs in London, the Blackfriars pub. There's one of the friars there guarding over the entrance here to the City of London. So on the South Bank, that was not the city. That was part of the county of Surrey. London, from here on, all the way to the Tower of London, it was run by the Puritans. The Puritans hated everything. Theatre, singing, dancing, sport, gambling, animal fighting. You know, it wasn't a fun place to live. A place of hard work and prayer. And now we're entering that city with a capital C. But strangely, there was a theatre here, just inside the city wall. And it was called the Blackfriars Playhouse. Now, why was it allowed to be here? That was a mystery for many years. Why they allowed the Puritans a theatre, a playhouse, inside the city walls. And then academics found out it wasn't a regular theatre company that performed there. It was a child's theatre company. The children were performing morality tales, religious stories, parables. The stories were not exciting. They were not full of revenge and intrigue and betrayal. They weren't bawdy. They weren't encouraging free thought like a lot of Shakespeare's plays were. They were promoting the idea of hard work, prayer, and know your place. So that's why they were allowed. But many years later, near the end of Shakespeare's career, actually, in 1608, the Blackfriars Playhouse became an area for regular theatre, an indoor theatre. The plays were still in the afternoons. They would put shutters to cover the windows, and they would light the playhouses by candlelight. This is Playhouse Yard, so the site of the monastery and also the site of the Blackfriars Playhouse. If you've ever been to the Globe Theatre, They have two playhouses there, the Globe itself, the outdoor building, and the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse, which is an indoor candlelit theatre based on the Blackfriars, which was just on this site in Playhouse Yard. A myth from the time, from the early 1600s, is that these roads, these lanes, these quiet alleyways would have been lit with torches. You see it in TV shows like The Witcher. You see it in Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon. You see it in Lord of the Rings. A company of soldiers or dwarves or elves, they turn up to a town and there are lights all the way along, all through the night. And that's a myth. Those lights would last 15 minutes. You couldn't have somebody all the way through the night just lighting torches constantly. It would be like spinning plates. These alleyways were dark. The roofs at the top of these buildings, thank you so much, Trish. The alleyways would be covered in thatched roofs. They would overhang, creating very, very dark alleyways. How did people get home when they left a theatre at 4:30 when it was getting dark? They would walk along an alleyway like this, and they would often find what we now call a link boy. Be a boy about 10, 12 years old, with a quiver, which normally you'd have arrows in that, and it'd be on his back. It would have small torches. And he might be waiting just over here, maybe in this little alcove. And he'd see a member of the aristocracy and he'd think, well, that guy needs help getting home in the dark. And he'd say, for a penny, I'll lead you home. He'd light the torch and he'd walk up these dark alleyways. These alleyways would be muddy. This path would be the beaten track or the beaten path. They would use limestone plaster. They would grind down hazelnut shells to dry out the muddy ground, an early version of cement. So this was the beaten track or the beaten path. If there was a criminal in the area, he might often pay the link boy twice what the aristocracy would, just to lead him off the beaten path. Maybe he'd say, come into this churchyard and I'll take the guy's money and I'll give you half of it. This is the site of St. Anne's Blackfriars, which was a church in the centre of the monastery. It's only open during the daytime. There's some very, very old gravestones in there, some from the 1500s. Now we're talking Friday night here. It is busy in town, but these side streets, they are off the beaten path. Shakespeare knew this area well. He worked mainly on the other side of the river. But near the end of his career, he bought a property on this side of the river. And we're going to see the site of it in a moment. Just going to show you Friar Street. So you can see literally how empty it is on a Friday night. It's only 8 o'clock. There's nobody here. Quite eerie. You might have heard the church bell there. That would have been the soundtrack to Shakespeare's time in London. Whenever there was a death from the plague, a church bell would ring. And often throughout the plays, all you hear, or all that's mentioned, is bell ringing. They never mentioned the plague, only a couple of times in the plays. But they mentioned bell ringing quite a bit. There are some people around. So I'm going a bit more into civilization now. This building here is the site of a gatehouse which led into the monastery. And in 1613, on the 10th of March, William Shakespeare bought a property just here. Less than 4 months later, the Globe Theatre burned down on the other side of the river. Shakespeare went back to Stratford and he never came to London again. So we have no evidence that he ever lived here, the site of the old Blackfriars Gatehouse. He did hand it down to his daughter. She handed it down to her daughter, Elizabeth. And then the family line of William Shakespeare died out. His grandchild, Elizabeth, died childless. So to this day, there are no descendants of William Shakespeare that we know of. Who would have worked in this area? Well, the link boys worked. The pubs would often stay open. The taverns, the inns. It was a cold time. It was a dark time. It was quite a scary time, really. And often you would leave your home at whatever time of the evening just to come into a tavern like this for warmth and for a bit of light. This is called the cockpit. Animal fighting was a big attraction in Shakespeare's time. Some of the buildings, not the Globe, but some of the other theatres on the South Bank, would have half animal fighting, half theatre. They believe one of the theatres, the Swan, had a removable stage. And the cockpit here painted some snow scenes just pre-Christmas, and I think they're just going to leave them up because they are seasonal. They don't need to be there just for Christmas. These are electric lights, but some in the area are gas lights. The gas lights are very evocative. They give a different light. They attract the insects, so they're good for the environment. And also, a lot of the gas lights burn methane from the sewers. So environmentally, they're fantastic. That looked amazing at night. And that pub is open, but it's a little bit too chilly for people to stand outside. So Shakespeare gets to 18 years old, and there's no mystery about his life for a few years. He gets married to a woman who's slightly older than him. Anne Hathaway is her name. She has one child, Susanna, and a couple of years later, she has two more twins, Judith and Hamnet, Hamnett. That's 1585. There is no mention of William Shakespeare for another 7 years. Not that academics have found it, and it's not for want of searching. The next time he is mentioned by anyone is in 1592, and he's mentioned by another writer, Robert Greene, who calls him an upstart crow. And a crow was a bird that would take the feathers of other birds to make their nests, to make themselves feel better. And Robert Greene was saying that Shakespeare did the same with other writing. They would take, some of the writers were quite open about it. They took other people's work and they tarted it up a bit. They beautified it. They added extra characters. They might have changed the plots. Shakespeare wrote 38 plays. And there are only 4 plays which we don't have sources or origins for. Now, the last time I did this is a slightly private area, but at this time of night, I'm going to give us a little walk in here. Hopefully the signal will stay. It's called Wardrobe Place. Now, I know that guys in the US and Canada and other parts of the world, they say the word closet. We say wardrobe. But a wardrobe was literally a walk-in wardrobe. And this was King Henry VIII's private wardrobe. So he'd come from Greenwich and he's on his way to Hampton Court. And there was a building here full of clothing for him. Now, because we're in a little alleyway and because it's so quiet around, I hope that you can appreciate. I can appreciate my sound bouncing off the walls, and I've got a good microphone, so I think the sound is quite evocative. I think it's working quite well. I hope you agree with that. I think I sound okay, but it's all to do with the buildings. That's lovely. Thank you so much. So there's a bit of an atmosphere we're creating here. People live here now. Some people work here. But we're in the City of London, and these are some of the most exclusive residential properties. And it's so quiet in the evening. A Friday night. All the pubs, when I walked here this evening off the train, they're packed. It's been a wet week, a drizzly, miserable week. Although it's cold, it's dry, it's crisp, and people are out and about. So this mention of William Shakespeare in 1592 by Robert Greene. Robert Greene is saying, you're a crow, you're taking the feathers of other writers and you're making yourself look better. And that's what we believe he did. We don't think, it's no secret really, that Shakespeare didn't come up with all the stories. A lot of the stories are historical. A lot of them come from a book called Ovid's Metamorphosis. Some of them come from another book, Holinshed's Chronicles. But a story like Hamlet was a Viking myth about a boy, Amleth, Amleth, who sees the murder of his father and he vows to get revenge. And when he grows up, he stows away on a slave ship which is going to his uncle's island, vowing, never forgetting that he wants to get revenge. And the uncle has, of course, gone off with Amleth's mother. Now, Shakespeare takes the story and he does something clever with it. Instead of a simple tale about a boy getting revenge, well, it's a ghost. He sees the ghost of his father. So he's never actually 100% sure if the ghost is real. Here is the site of the Bell on Carter Lane. That's the road we're on now. Do I know the BBC sitcom Upstart Crow? I do indeed. It's fantastic. It's the imagined life of William Shakespeare in Stratford-upon-Avon. So it's a sitcom about his home life, written by Ben Elton, starring David Mitchell, Lisa Tarbuck. I know it well. It's a fantastic show, isn't it? But we're on the road Carter Lane. And this was the site of the Bell. Now, this man, Richard Quinney is his name. He wrote a letter to William Shakespeare. It's the only letter that we have that was addressed to Shakespeare. Never got to him, actually. Richard Quinney's son married Shakespeare's daughter. Richard Quinney was from Stratford-upon-Avon. And Richard Quinney came to London to talk to the Earl of Stratford because Stratford-upon-Avon had had a bad harvest. And he wanted the Earl of Stratford to let them off with taxes, give them some kind of rebate so the families could survive. And the Earl of Stratford, he was lobbying him, really. That's what he was doing. He followed him to London to beg some financial assistance. And the Earl of Stratford said no. He writes a letter to William Shakespeare asking for money, to lend him money, the equivalent of now about £30,000. The letter, we know, doesn't get to Shakespeare, so it wasn't found on Shakespeare's possessions. It was found in Richard Quinney's possessions a few years later when he was found dead, murdered in another pub in the City of London. And it's believed that he had an altercation with the Earl of Stratford's men, and they must have goaded him, and he took the bait, and they killed him. The letter was found. It's possible that he bumped into Shakespeare in the pub. And maybe he just asked Shakespeare for the money. But we know that the letter was never sent. And mail riders or postal riders were some of the only people allowed to work at night. Taking a letter anywhere was an expensive business. Shakespeare's son, Hamnet, died when he was 11. It's likely that Shakespeare didn't find out about that for 6 months while he was working in the summer and then went home for the winter to write plays and be with the family. And that's when he found out about it. There's a big mystery about Shakespeare writing plays which are very dark and quite depressing when he's earning his most money, when he's at his most financially successful at the Globe. And it's probably because he had family issues. His wife would have said, "Where were you? We needed you. Your son passed away and you were in London." And it sent him into that dark place. The beautiful St. Paul's, lit just perfectly at night. Not the original St. Paul's. St. Paul's Church was destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. That one is a funky new modern building from 1708, so it's still a youngster in London terms. When Shakespeare was working in London, if he needed to get something printed or he wanted to buy writing equipment, he would go to the lit area over there, St. Paul's Churchyard, which was where all the booksellers and the quill makers and the paper sellers, the bookbinders, anything to do with stationery were based around St. Paul's. And the word stationery comes from the book people. They were dragging things along lanes, like the lane we've just walked along, Carter Lane. And it's called Carter Lane because this would be a beaten track, a straight road where you could drag carts along. And it was heavy stuff. They're dragging books and leather and the skin of sturgeon fish just to bind books and bringing books with them as well. And they asked the local authorities, the Puritans, the city fathers, could they have fixed locations for their shops around St. Paul's? And they gave them stationary shops, fixed locations. And it's where we now get that word, stationary. Now, during the day, this would be something we could stand in front of this for a long time and study the City of London. But what I will show you, that's where we are. And that's where we came from. And this is where we are going. Over the river, over this tiny, tiny speck of a line here, the Millennium Bridge. And that's the Tate Modern, which we'll see as we come around this corner. There is nothing as satisfying in life to me as looking at a detailed map. And we don't do enough of it, do we? We use our Google Maps, we use our sat-navs, our TomToms. We might know the route, but we don't know where we are. Both stationary came from stationary. So the word, the spelling changed. Like aluminium. This is a monument to the Great Fire of London and all the firefighters who worked from then on. It was originally a monument to the firefighters who worked during the Blitz of World War II, but now it's a monument to all firefighters from 1666, when the first fire services ever came into London. and they're pointing towards the city behind. The fire lasted 5 days. 80% of London was destroyed. Now imagine you were a firefighter during the Great Fire of London. Before they had a need for a fire service, you simply got a big syringe, and 10 men would carry this long syringe all the way to the river, and they would squeeze it, suck up like they were extracting blood, but they were extracting water, and then they would walk back to the fire and then put out what they could. So something good came out of the Great Fire of London. The fire service started. Now we're on Peter's Hill, named after St. Peter, and the bridge in front is the Millennium Footbridge. So the ideas for the plays, let's go back to that. Shakespeare wrote a very famous play called The Merchant of Venice, and he is, no doubt about it, discussing the problems and the issues surrounding anti-Semitism in London. The Jewish population had been banned from London, banished from the 1200s, but they were still there. They weren't allowed to work, they weren't allowed to own property, and they couldn't admit who they were. If they had money, the way they tried to make a living was by lending money and getting it back at interest. And the Merchant of Venice discusses the idea of if a moneylender lends you money and you refuse to pay it back, who sins most? Who is the real criminal? But he didn't want to set the play in London. He doesn't want to get in trouble. He doesn't want to criticize the authorities. So he calls the play The Merchant of Venice, and he sets it in Italy. But there's another link to Shakespeare's family. His father, John, was caught doing this crime, usury, U-S-E-R-Y, money lending. And he got his status taken away. He was an alderman, a council official in Stratford-upon-Avon, and because he was caught money lending, he was disgraced. So Shakespeare's not only writing about anti-Semitism, he's also taking personal stories from his own life. Just going to cross quickly and show us here the College of Arms. The reason I mentioned the Merchant of Venice and Shakespeare's dad here is because this was the College of Arms, still is, from the 1400s. This is where you would come to get a coat of arms, really. Let's have a look at the chat. Ellen Reed, my wish from Santa. Wow, so it's a long one. Let me read this, sorry. Was an atlas and I got my wish, a beautiful Oxford atlas. I can see where I am during Beam's tours. That is fantastic. And there we go. So we've got the Stratford, Ontario, the Shakespeare Festival there. I worked at a restaurant called the Globe Hotel, which was owned by a family of Stratford actors. Oh, wonderful. I haven't, and it is on my list. I meet so many people from Stratford, Ontario, and they say, come, stay with us. And I say, I want to. The Shakespeare Festival in Stratford, Ontario is supposed to be wonderful. Oh, I want to come. No doubt about it. Too many places to visit, but that is definitely up there with the top of them. If you've seen the film, so nothing to do with Shakespeare, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the only Bond film that George Lazenby made, he got his commander of the British Empire, so he became Commander Bond, and he walks in here, and that's where he receives it. And then a couple of years ago, Daniel Craig walked in here and got exactly the same honour, which I think is only right, because that man reinvigorated that entire franchise. Anyone's interested in Harry Potter, the bridge we are approaching, the Millennium Footbridge, is synonymous with Harry Potter. the Death Eaters in one of the films, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1, destroy the footbridge. I do get students and fans of Harry Potter saying it's a little bit historically inaccurate. The bridge opened in 2000. The films and the books are set in the mid 1990s, and they do say, some of them, how could the Death Eaters have destroyed a bridge that wasn't there? Answer me that. And I say, well, you're telling me that's the historically inaccurate part. Do you want to talk about wizards and Quidditch and flying and broomsticks and all of that? They say, no, you're changing the subject. Never argue with a Harry Potter fan. They know their stuff. Talking of Harry Potter, this is the city of Westminster School. This is where Daniel Radcliffe went. And when he got in the films, he had to leave the school. He said he was bullied. And I have no doubt he was at the age of 11. He would have been bullied. He was a slight young lad. But he was homeschooled, and he was also schooled on set as well. So he got a good education. And he seems like a very down-to-earth, very level-headed young lad. He's done well for himself. Now, if you were walking in the dark in Shakespeare's time, what you would see on that side of the river is not the site in front of us, not the Tate Modern or the Bankside power station, but it would be heavily lit. There was an area on the other side called Holland's Liga, and it was an entertainment complex, if you will, run by a woman called Bess Holland. So it had everything. It had animal fighting, dancing, other forms of fighting, brothels, and it was all lit all the way around with bonfires, so you could see it from everywhere. And that side of the river was what they called a liberty. On the south bank, you weren't under Puritan rule. The theatres, most of them, were on the south bank. Some of them were north of London, but most of them were in this area, Bankside. And we know of 3 properties that Shakespeare lived in. We know the one that we just saw, which he bought, but he never lived in. 2 of the properties in London were on the other side of the river, on the north side. And then one was on this side, on a road called Clink Street. And you may have been on one of my other Shakespeare tours, which walks all the way to the Globe from London Bridge. Clink Street is the site of an old prison, a debtor's prison. If you owed money, you were put in a debtor's prison. So the biggest crimes in Shakespeare's time were financial crimes. Now, look at this view. So you get a bit of the footbridge. The main thing you get are the lights of the Shard, Renzo Piano's fantastic building. It's 12 years old now. London is built on clay, so it's 12 years of that building being a site on the skyline above London Bridge Station. And if you go 65 yards down into the ground, you find bedrock. So that's where the foundations are, just there. So you've got that side, the South Bank. This, in a way, is new London. And it doesn't look that different from what is now considered old London. That is the financial district. And just behind these buildings, there is a road called London Wall, which goes all the way from the Tower around St. Paul's Cathedral all the way to Blackfriars. Inside that wall, the Puritans were in charge. And another site here, the iconic Tower Bridge. Everything's looking lovely. They illuminate the bridges at night, which makes the river look fantastic. And then you have the riverboats there, so that bit at the bottom there, the white lights that's stretching across, is where you catch the riverboat from. And then there's the Globe Theatre, which is always lit at night. There's no myth or mystery about Shakespeare's time at the Globe. We know that he started work there as soon as it opened in 1599 and it burned to the ground. And we know this exactly because of somebody's diary on the 29th of June 1613 at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The play was on. It was called All is True. We now call it Henry VIII, Shakespeare's final play in London. Henry walks on stage and they fire a cannon in the middle of the play as a sound effect when he enters. Not a cannonball, a ball of wool packed with gunpowder, which they then dipped in oil and set fire to before they put it in the cannon. So they launched it towards what is basically a wood and straw building, thinking, what could possibly go wrong? Well, what could go wrong did go wrong. The theatre burnt down in 6 hours. William Shakespeare went back to Stratford upon Avon, and he never came to London again, died 3 years later at the age of 52. When he died, only half of his plays had been performed and written and published. 18 of them were still not in print. 7 years after he died, two of his acting company, Hemmings and Condell, got together with the publisher and said, do you think you could make money from these 36 manuscripts? And the publisher said, oh, yes. And they sold them to a publisher. And in 1623, it was released as a book called The First Folio. And if you've got a copy of one now, it's worth a couple of £1 million. I'll probably do a First Folio show at one point and read speeches and sonnets, maybe from home, maybe on location around here. But I think by now, after being an actor 25 years and talking so much in the last year about William Shakespeare, it's about time I performed some as well. Now, I'm going to show you the other side of the bridge. We won't get over all the way to the Globe. And you know what? They're filming. They're filming a new Netflix film called Back in Action with Charlize Theron and Jamie Foxx. And they're filming along the South Bank, so you can't actually get there. The building in front of us, by the way, some people call it the Gherkin. They say that's the Gherkin. The Gherkin is behind us. This is not the Gherkin. This is colloquially known as the Boomerang, but the address is 1 Blackfriars. And that's one of the largest residential buildings in the country, the Boomerang. And that's where we started, just beyond there, near the Unilever building in the centre of the screen, and near Blackfriars train station over there. And I, my friends, have managed to keep to time, and I'm very, very proud of myself for doing that. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for your comments and so many interesting comments. Thank you for any payments, any donations, any tips. We call them what we will, but your generosity and your kindness is what keeps us going. You're very, very kind, and I've had a lovely time out here. And hopefully I'll see you again next week. I'm going to schedule quite a few more shows. There's a few that I've got made on Beams, but I haven't scheduled any of them, so they won't have come up on my portfolio yet. But there's a few I've been working on that I haven't worked on and haven't shown on other platforms. So there'll be a few Beams only exclusives. And as I was saying last night, the one thing I like about Beams is that we have a lovely silence and reverence when we do the tours. I love a chat and I love comments, but sometimes you feel there are thousands of them and you don't know whether to ignore them or carry on. But I love the fact that we can just do a tour, and if there's a good little question, we get into it. One second. Just walked past the lunatic children. Oh, they were okay, actually. They weren't too bad. There you go. They're gone. That's why I did that. They were that you thought that they were going to get involved. No. Did you hear what he said? Are you on live? And I said no. And he went, oh well. And he walked away. If I had said yes, he would have definitely got involved. Lovely lads, out for the night. Okay, enough of my face. One final view of London. If I can do this. Thank you so much again. Thank you for your kindness, your comments, your support. And I will see you very, very soon. If you want to know how the Millennium Bridge was reconstructed, some of you may know this already. It is a suspension bridge. So if you imagine the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge, the suspension wires go straight up. We have a height restriction in this area, so it is suspended diagonally. It's stretched to the side. But it opened in 2000 for one day and wobbled so much with 8,000 people on it at the same time that they had to close it for a year and a half. They closed it, they reopened it 18 months later, and they had put these in. They're like shock absorbers. So these are the important bits of the Millennium Footbridge that stop it from wobbling. Fluid dampeners. So if it does wobble, you put fluid in here and it stops the sway. So there you go. You've got something 22 years old and a reconstruction of something that is from 1599 and burnt to the ground in 1613. Lots of love. I will see you very, very soon. Thank you for your kindness. Au revoir.